Wake up with the morning light, mountain air a chillin' bite. Got my pack, I'm good to go, where the river currents flow.
We continue the exciting true-life Alaskan adventure story of Norman and Sylvia Wilkins. If you missed any earlier episodes, please be sure to go back and enjoy them. The Alaska Diaries is a narrated true story based on first-hand journal account from 1979 through the 80s and 90s, following one couple's journey to build a life in the Alaskan wilderness. Told in immersive, audiobook-style episodes, this series brings you into the mud, the cold, the danger, and the determination it takes to keep going. Subscribe and follow the journey if you enjoy true survival stories, wilderness adventure, and real-life grit. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. New episodes premiere weekly. The Alaska Diaries, Episode 13, Teaching a Youngster to Hunt. Part 1. By August of 1981, summer was beginning to loosen its grip on Alaska. You could feel it in the mornings before you could see it anywhere else. The sun still rose early, but there was a colder edge to the air now when I stepped outside the cabin at Nelchina. Dew stayed longer on the grass. Fog drifted low over the little ponds and beaver sloughs. The swans had started gathering in bigger groups, and every now and then you could hear geese talking overhead long before you saw them. Fall was coming. In Alaska, that meant people got busy in a hurry. Nobody with any sense wasted August. There was always wood to cut, machines to repair, roofs to patch, supplies to haul, traps to get ready, cabins to finish before snow came. Winter out, there wasn't just a season. It was a force that moved toward you slowly for months. And if you ignored it, you paid for it later. That August seemed especially full of little jobs. One day, I was helping Henry with his loader and hauling trash. Another day, I was up on the lodge roof spreading tar before the rains got worse. Then I'd spend an afternoon crawling around under the dryer, trying to keep the belt lined up on the pulley so the thing would run more than 2 days at a time. Nothing ever stayed fixed long in the bush. If a machine wasn't breaking, it was getting ready too. Still, there was satisfaction in keeping things going. I remember one evening after working on the D, for Cat most of the afternoon, I sat outside the cabin with a cup of coffee watching the light fade over the hills. The mosquitoes had finally eased off some by then, and for once the air was still. Henry walked over from the lodge, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. "You get that cat running?" he asked. "Think so. You sound doubtful." "Well," I said, "it's running right now." He laughed. "That's about the best anybody can hope for around here." That was true enough. A lot of people romanticize Alaska, but much of life there was simply maintenance. Keeping equipment alive, keeping fuel dry, keeping roofs from leaking, keeping trucks moving, keeping yourself moving. But in between the work, life had a rhythm to it I've never forgotten. People drifted in and out of the lodge constantly that summer. Pilots, mechanics, hunters, neighbors from up the road, travelers heading toward Glen Allen or farther north. You'd see somebody in the afternoon, and suddenly half the evening disappeared around a coffee table, listening to stories. Some nights we'd end up over at Taslina Lodge playing pool or listening to music. Other nights, there'd be little gatherings out by the lake where somebody cooked fish or moose meat over a fire while everybody swapped news. There weren't many secrets in country like that. Everybody knew who had broken down where, who shot a moose, who got weathered in, who needed help roofing a cabin, and who had gone into Anchorage for supplies. One Sunday, Charlie and I canoed across Snowshoe Lake to a cabin he had permission to use. He was trying to get it ready before freeze up. The lake was calm as glass that morning. Charlie paddled in front while I sat in the stern, watching the shoreline slide past. Loons called somewhere off toward the far timber, and now and then a fish rolled out in deeper water. "You think this old place will stand another winter?" Charlie asked. "Depends. On what? How much work you put into it before the snow comes?" He grunted. "That's always your answer." Because it's usually true. The cabin leaned a little when we reached it, but most cabins in Alaska lean sooner or later. We spent the better part of the day hauling things around, checking the roof, and talking about insulating before the cold set in hard. That was the thing about those little bush cabins. They were never really finished. Every season added something new to them. A woodshed, better stove pipe, extra insulation, a new bunk, a patched window. Cabins evolved along with the people living in them. A few evenings later, I went into Taslina again and wound up staying late. There was dancing going on that night, and quite a crowd had gathered. Somebody had hauled in beer, and somebody else had brought records. You could hear the music before you even got through the door. The place smelled like cigarette smoke, wet jackets, perfume, and beer, pretty standard for Alaska roadhouses in those days. I remember seeing Lloyd and Chris running there. Chris came over grinning. "You still alive out there in the swamp?" "Barely." "Well, don't die before hunting season. I'm going to need somebody to complain about the weather with." "You can complain to Lloyd." Chris shook his head. "He complains too much already." Lloyd threw a napkin at him from across the table. That was another thing about bush country. Humor mattered, probably more than people realize. When winters get long and machines break down and money gets tight and weather strands you for days, people who can laugh survive better than people who can't. Around that same time, I took Jerry out to mend Deltona Creek to watch the salmon spawning. The reds were packed thick in the gravel runs, bags cutting the current like dark knives. Jerry stood there watching them. "Seems strange they protect this spot from fishing," he said. "Best spawning gravel around," I told him. "Without places like this, you don't keep salmon." Then a black bear stepped out of the brush upstream. He walked right into the creek without the slightest concern for us. Jerry froze. The bear slapped a salmon on his shore and dragged it off casually like he'd done it 1,000 times. "Well," Jerry said quietly, "guess nobody explained the regulations to him." I laughed. Bears generally don't attend meetings. The truth was, the bears understood the salmon better than we did. That creek belonged to them long before it belonged to people. By the middle of August, another project started taking up more and more of my time, helping Charlie finish his cabin over by Snowshoe Lake. We worked on that place for days. Roofing first, then insulation, then stretching visqueen across the ceiling to help hold heat once winter came. Charlie's friend Dennis helped too. One afternoon, we were all standing on ladders wrestling a sheet of visqueen that kept catching wind. Dennis swore at it. "This stuff's got a mind of its own." "No," I said, "the wind's got a mind of its own." Charlie laughed. "Same difference." We finally got it stapled in place, though not gracefully. By then, all three of us were sweating despite the cool weather. Charlie climbed down and looked around proudly. "Feels more like a real cabin now." "It is a real cabin," I said. "Not till winter says so." That was another Alaska truth. The cabin didn't prove itself until January. Around this same time, I started spending more time with Doug. Doug was 15, tall for his age, skinny as a rail, and serious about almost everything. His dad wanted him to learn hunting properly and thought I might help with that. I liked the boy almost immediately. Not because he talked a lot. Actually, he didn't. But he listened. That's rare in teenagers sometimes. The first thing I taught him wasn't hunting. It was shooting. There's a difference. Too many people think owning a rifle automatically makes somebody a hunter. It doesn't. A hunter understands patience, judgment, safety, weather, distance, animals, and responsibility. The shooting part is only one piece. I started Doug out with my 20-gauge shotgun, a lighter gun, manageable recoil, something he could learn confidence with. We set cans along a gravel bank one evening outside Nelchina. Doug held the shotgun carefully, almost too carefully. "You nervous?" I asked. "A little." "Good. Means you're paying attention." I showed him how to stand, how to hold the stock tight against his shoulder, how to squeeze instead of jerk the trigger. "All right," I said. "Take your time." Boom. First tin can jump clean off the log. Doug blinked in surprise. I nodded. Again. Boom. Second tin can flip backward. Now he was grinning. "Not bad," I said. "I hit it." "You did." "I really hit it." "Well, sure," I laughed. "What did you think was going to happen?" From there, we moved farther out. He kept hitting. Not every shot, but enough. More important, he stayed calm. A lot of boys his age got excited and careless once they started doing well. Doug got quieter instead. That told me something. After we finished shooting, we sat on the tailgate, eating sandwiches while evening settled over the valley. Doug finally asked, "When did you start hunting?" "Oh, younger than you." Did somebody teach you? Some did. Some didn't. He looked over curiously. What do you mean? I took a sip of coffee before answering. Some lessons you learn because somebody helps you. Other lessons you learn because nobody did. He thought about that for a long moment. I could see already he was the kind of kid who carried word around afterward. A few days later, we discovered he didn't have ammunition for the rifle he wanted to hunt with. So I told him, looks like you're riding to Anchorage with me. You would have thought I invited him to climb Mount McKinley. At 15, a supply trip to Anchorage with older men felt like entering adulthood. We left early. Fog still hung low over parts of the Glen Highway, and the mountains looked blue in the distance. Doug spent half the drive asking questions about hunting. What's the farthest shot you ever made? What's the closest you've ever gotten to a bear? What happens if weather comes in? What if somebody gets hurt? I answered most of them honestly, sometimes too honestly. What if you miss? He asked at one point. You probably will eventually. He looked surprised. Even you, especially me. That made him laugh. Then I told him something I believed deeply. Missing isn't the worst thing. What is? Hurting something because you rushed. That quieted him down for a while. On the way home, one of the truck tires blew. Hard. The whole truck lurched sideways and gravel rattled underneath us. Doug grabbed the dashboard. I eased us onto the shoulder and shut the engine off. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then Doug let out a long breath. Thought we were going in the ditch. Me too. We climbed out and looked at the ruined tire. Well, I said, there's your Alaska lesson for today. What's that? Something always happens. We changed the tire alongside the highway while traffic blasted past us. Doug worked hard without complaining. By the time we got rolling again, the sun was dropping lower over the mountains, and I remember thinking that he was at exactly the right age for Alaska to get hold of him. Not just the scenery, the responsibility of it, the seriousness, the freedom, the danger too, especially the danger, because the country taught lessons faster than people did sometimes. And before long, I was going to take him out into it for real. Part 2. By the time we finally arranged the hunting trip, Doug had been talking about little else for days. Every time I saw him, he had another question. How far out is the cabin? What if we see wolves? Do caribou really come close to camp sometimes? What kind of food are we taking? I answered what I could without teasing him too much, though truthfully, I enjoyed seeing that kind of excitement. There was something good about a young person wanting to learn the outdoors instead of sitting around wasting time. The trip itself depended entirely on weather and airplanes, which meant nothing was certain until it actually happened. That was life in bush Alaska. You learn not to celebrate plans too early. Chris Ronning agreed to fly us out. Chris was one of those pilots who looked completely at ease no matter what conditions were doing. He had a calmness about him that people trusted, and in that country, trust mattered more than fancy credentials. The morning of August 20th arrived gray and damp. Doug showed up early with his gear already packed. He tried to act casual, but he was wound up tighter than a spring. You sleep at all? I asked him. Not much. That's about normal before your first flying hunt. He grinned. I kept thinking about bears. You should think more about mosquitoes. That made him laugh nervously. Before Doug flew in, Chris took me out first with part of the gear. As we crossed over the country toward my cabin, I looked down across the rolling tundra and lakes shining between the ridges. Even after all my time there, that country still got hold of me. There are places in Alaska that feel ancient in a way that is difficult to explain. The land looks unfinished and untouched all at once. No roads, no wires, no engines except the one carrying you overhead. Just lakes, brush, timber, muskeg, and mountains fading into distance. Chris tipped the plane slightly and pointed. There, he said through the headset. I looked down and spotted movement. Caribou. Several animals moving through open country near one of the benches above the lakes. A little farther on, we saw a moose feeding near the edge of some brush. Hunting looks decent, Chris said. Sure does. The cabin came into view shortly afterward, sitting alone near the lake with weathered logs darkened by years of snow and rain. Every time I saw that cabin from the air, I felt the same thing. Relief. Not because it was luxurious. It certainly wasn't. But because it meant shelter, warmth, dry clothes, coffee on a cold morning. In country like that, a cabin was more than a structure. It was security. Chris dropped me off first and said he would bring Doug in next. While waiting, I checked the place over carefully. No broken windows, no porcupine damage, no squirrel nests in the bedding. That alone counted as good fortune. I swept the floor, aired things out, stacked gear inside, and got the stove ready. Clouds drifted low across the hills, and now and then a little rain spit against the roof. A while later, I heard the plane returning. Doug climbed out looking around like he had just landed on another planet. "This is unbelievable," he said quietly. Well, I told him, "Welcome to the neighborhood." He turned slowly, taking everything in, the lake, the hills, the silence, the cabin. "You stay out here alone?" "Most of the time." He looked at me differently after that. I think the reality of it finally settled into him. Hearing about wilderness and standing inside it are two different things entirely. By evening, the weather worsened. Rain came hard against the cabin roof while the wind pushed mist across the lake. We sat inside cooking supper while water rattled against the stovepipe. Doug looked around the little cabin carefully. "This sure beats a tent." "Oh, you figured that out already?" "Yes, sir." "You're learning fast." He smiled at that. After supper, we unpacked gear and organized things for the next morning. I always believed camp should be kept orderly. Losing equipment or wasting time searching for something in bad weather could turn into real trouble. Doug noticed the system quickly. "You always put things back in the same spot." "Usually." "Why?" "Because someday you might need them in a hurry." That answer seemed to stick with him. Rain hammered the roof most of the night, but sometime before dawn the weather cleared. We woke to cold, fresh air and pale sunlight slipping through the cabin windows. I got breakfast started while Doug pulled on his boots. "What are we having?" he asked. "Enough food to keep you walking." I fried bacon and potatoes while coffee boiled on the stove. Doug ate like a starving farmhand. "That's good," I told him. A hunter who doesn't eat breakfast usually regrets it. We packed light gear and headed south first. Right away, the country started working on him. Tundra looks smooth from far away, but walking it is another matter entirely. Every step lands unevenly. Hidden holes twist ankles. Wet moss grabs your boots. Brush pulls at your legs. Within an hour, Doug was breathing hard, trying to keep pace. "You don't have to race me," I told him. "I'm okay." "I know you are. Slow down anyway." That is one thing young men often misunderstand. Endurance matters more than speed in the outdoors. The farther we walked, the quieter Doug became. At first, he pointed at everything: ducks on ponds, strange tracks, distant hills. But after a while, the country settled him down. He started paying attention instead of just looking around. That was a good sign. Around midday, we stopped near a little rise and ate sandwiches while glassing the hills. Doug studied everything through binoculars. "How do you know where animals will be?" "You don't always, but you seem to." I laughed. "No, I just know where they might be." There's a difference. That afternoon, I took him north and showed him an old bear den dug into the hillside. Doug crouched near the opening. "You ever see one in there?" "Not while I was standing this close." He smiled uneasily. "You think one's inside now?" "No." "How can you tell?" "Smell." He looked surprised. Then he leaned forward and sniffed cautiously before jerking backward. "That smells awful." "Exactly." We continued farther along the ridge and eventually spotted a caribou at long distance. Doug froze instantly. "Where?" I pointed. "There, just crossing that opening." He found it through the scope. For a moment, the animal stood clear against the brush, antlers visible above the tundra. Then it disappeared. That was too far anyway, I told him. Doug kept staring through the scope. "I still can't believe how fast they vanish." "You'll learn. Animals survive because they notice things first." We returned to the cabin near evening. On the way back, a flock of ducks exploded off one of the lakes, wings whistling through the air. Doug watched them go. "Everything out here seems wild." "That's because it is." Back at camp, I cleaned around the cabin while Doug wandered nearby, picking blueberries. After a while, he came inside, carrying a little pot nearly full. "Thought maybe we could cook these." "Now you're really thinking." He mixed the berries with sugar while I split a little wood outside. The evening turned calm and beautiful after the rain. Low clouds drifted pink over the hills, and the lake went nearly flat. Then we heard engines overhead. 2 planes passed low over the cabin. Doug stepped outside watching them. Chris and Dan checking on us. Probably. That's pretty nice. It is. Bush pilots watched out for people because someday they might need somebody watching out for them too. That night, Doug fixed himself hot chocolate after supper and sat by the window, drinking it while dusk settled over the country. He looked younger then, not like a hunter trying to prove himself. Just a 15-year-old boy sitting in a remote cabin feeling very far from home. You miss your family yet? I asked. A little. That's normal. He nodded. Then after a pause, he asked quietly, did you ever get scared out here alone? I thought about it honestly before answering. Yes. What scared you most? Probably weather. Not bears. Bears usually make sense. And weather doesn't. Not always. He considered that carefully. That was another reason I liked Doug. He listened seriously when people spoke honestly to him. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Perfect hunting weather. We ate a big breakfast and started climbing toward Nye Lake. The climb from Whole Lake up toward Nye was steep enough to humble anybody carrying a rifle and gear. Halfway up, Doug's breathing got ragged. Stop a minute, I told him. I'm okay. I know. Stop anyway. We stood there looking out across the valley below us. Fog still drifted over parts of the lower lakes, and sunlight was beginning to strike the tops of the ridges. I showed him how to breathe slower and deeper while climbing. Most people fight the hill, I said. Don't fight it. Work with it. He nodded, trying to catch his breath. Take deep breaths. More oxygen means more strength in your legs. After a few minutes, we started upward again. This time his pace steadied. By the time we reached the country around Nye Lake, he was tired but moving well again. Then we spotted game. For caribou moving across open ground. Doug immediately dropped to one knee and raised the rifle. Easy, I whispered. We watched them through binoculars while they drifted along the edge of some brush. A little farther away stood two bull moose. One was broad and impressive enough that Doug nearly forgot the caribou entirely. That one's huge, he whispered. He's legal too. You gonna shoot him? No. Why not? Because we came for your caribou. He looked at me with surprise. Truthfully, I think that was the moment he realized I genuinely wanted him to succeed. Part 3. We spent most of that day working the country around Nye Lake. The weather could not have been much better for hunting. Cool air drifted across the ridges, and now and then thin sunlight broke through the clouds and lit up pieces of tundra in bright gold patches. The higher country around Nye always felt bigger and quieter than the lower lakes. Sound carried differently there. Even distant birds seemed sharper somehow. After watching the moose for a while, we moved carefully along the edge of a gravel esker that wound through the brush like an old railroad bed. I pointed toward it. Wolves den around here sometimes, I told Doug. He looked over immediately. Really? Yep. Good dry ground for raising pups. He studied the esker with new interest after that. At 15, every piece of wild country still carried mystery for him. Truthfully, I envied that a little. When you spend enough years outdoors, you gain knowledge, but you lose some of that first sense of wonder. We climbed onto the esker to glass the surrounding country. I'll take this end, I said. You stay here and watch that opening down there. Doug nodded seriously and settled into position with a rifle across his knees. For quite a while, neither of us saw anything. The wind moved softly through the brush below us, and somewhere off toward the lake a loon called. Every so often, Doug shifted slightly to stretch his legs, but otherwise he stayed patient. That pleased me. Patience is one of the hardest things to teach young hunters. Then finally I spotted movement. A bull caribou. A good one too. He appeared silently out of the brush below the far end of the esker, antlers rocking gently as he walked. I slipped quietly down the backside of the ridge and worked my way toward Doug. When I reached him, I crouched beside him and whispered, "Get ready." His whole posture tightened instantly. Where? Coming through the brush below us. Doug raised a rifle slowly, carefully. The bull kept walking. Closer, closer. I could see Doug trying to steady his breathing exactly the way I'd taught him. Then suddenly the caribou stopped. His head lifted. For 1 second, he stood perfectly still, and then he vanished. Not ran, not crashed away. He simply disappeared into the brush like smoke. Doug lowered the rifle slowly. What happened? Wind shifted. You think he smelled us? I know he did. Doug looked genuinely disappointed. I thought we had him. So did I. That is hunting sometimes. You could do almost everything right and still lose your chance because of one little swirl of air. We stayed in that area most of the afternoon, but never got another clean opportunity. We saw more moose moving through distant brush, and once we caught sight of a pale-colored cow moose with another animal nearby, but neither gave us a legal shot. By late afternoon, we started making our way back toward Whole Lake. Doug was tired by then, though he tried not to show it. I remember him asking quietly, "Do you ever get discouraged out here?" "All the time." "Really?" "Sure. Anybody who says otherwise is lying." That seemed to surprise him. I think boys often imagine experienced outdoorsmen walk into the wilderness with absolute confidence all the time. The truth is, most successful hunters simply learn how to continue even when things are not going well. As we neared the lower country, we heard an airplane engine. "Chris." The plane circled low overhead. Doug waved immediately. Chris dipped the wings and continued on. "He checking on us?" Doug asked. "Yep. Bush pilots do that. That's pretty nice. It can save somebody's life someday." Back at the cabin, we cleaned up a little, hauled in more water, and straightened equipment. I always believed camp chores mattered just as much as hunting. A sloppy camp usually meant sloppy thinking. Doug helped without complaint. That told me something too. A lot of boys wanted adventure right up until work appeared. Not Doug. That evening something happened neither of us forgot. I had stepped outside behind the cabin for something, I don't even remember what now, when suddenly I froze. 3 caribou stood just beyond the cabin. 1 medium bull and 2 others. They were unbelievably close. Maybe 12 feet away. The bull was lying down at first, chewing lazily, completely unaware I was there. I slipped back inside the cabin as quietly as I could. Doug looked up immediately. "What is it?" "Caribou," I whispered. His eyes widened. "Where?" "Right outside." He nearly knocked over his chair, scrambling for the rifle. "Easy," I hissed. "Slow down." We eased out of the cabin together. For one perfect moment, it looked like everything might finally come together for him. The bull stood broadside. Doug raised the rifle. Then, one of the animals caught movement. All 3 exploded at once. The tundra seemed to erupt beneath them as they wheeled and bounded away. I swung quickly and fired at the running bull. Missed clean. The sound echoed off the hills while the caribou disappeared into the brush. Silence afterward. Doug looked crushed. Then he looked at me. "You missed." "Sure did." That startled him enough that he almost laughed. "You never told me you miss." "Oh, I missed plenty." That helped more than I expected. Young people need to understand that failure is part of learning anything difficult. The next morning, we were up before daylight. Cold air had settled over the lake overnight, and frost glittered along the grass near the cabin. Doug came outside, rubbing his hands together. "Feels colder today. Fall's getting closer." We ate breakfast and headed back toward Nye Lake again. Before leaving, I walked down a Whole Lake and left a note for Chris in case plans changed while we were gone. Then we started climbing. The country looked different that morning. Clearer somehow. The sky had that sharp blue color Alaska sometimes gets in late August, when the first hints of autumn begin touching the tundra. We spotted caribou not long after reaching the upper country. 6 cows and a bull moving steadily across the area where I wanted to hunt. Doug dropped low behind the brush while we watched them pass. "Think that bull's legal?" he whispered. "Oh yeah." The animals moved through the opening and disappeared again before Doug ever had a real shot opportunity. We waited there a long time afterward, long enough for the stillness to settle around us completely. Eventually, we climbed onto another knoll overlooking the country. About 20 minutes later, a huge bull caribou walked directly through the exact place we had been sitting earlier. Doug stared through the binoculars in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." I laughed quietly. "That's how hunting works. I think the animals know where we are." Sometimes I think so too. As the day wore on, I could sense discouragement creeping into him despite all his effort not to show it. He was trying hard, walking hard, listening, paying attention, and still nothing had worked out. That is an important moment for young hunters. Some become careless or frustrated then. Others learn patience. We waited for Chris to arrive around mid-afternoon, but no plane appeared. Doug kept glancing toward the sky. "You think something happened?" "No. Probably got busy." Bush flying rarely runs on perfect schedules. Still, wilderness has a way of making people aware of distance. Waiting feels different out there than it does in town. You become conscious of how alone you really are. We eventually moved to another knoll near the far side of the lake. A little later, we saw another bull moving through the brush, though one antler appeared broken off. Still no clean shot. Finally, we turned back toward Whole Lake. Coming down the slope, my foot slipped between rocks and twisted my knee sharply enough to nearly put me on the ground. Doug grabbed my arm instantly. "You okay?" "Yeah," I muttered. "Just getting old." He grinned at that, though he stayed close afterward while we continued downhill. We reached Whole Lake tired and sore and settled in to wait for Chris. The evening around the lake was beautiful. Perfectly calm water. Fish rising now and then near shore. A loon circling low across the lake, calling mournfully. Far overhead, a hawk drifted slowly back and forth hunting. Doug skipped stones while we waited. Then the light began fading. Still no plane. Finally, just as dusk settled into the valley, we heard an engine. Doug stood immediately. Chris and Brent Myers came in low over the lake and dropped a smoke signal canister before landing. After tying the plane off down at the lake, they climbed up to the cabin with us. I already had coffee going. Chris pulled off his hat and laughed. "Sorry, boys. Longer day than I planned." Doug listened wide-eyed while Chris and Brent talked flying, weather, lakes, and hunting. To a 15-year-old boy, bush pilots probably seemed half cowboy and half magician. Later that night, after Chris and Brent left, Doug sat quietly for a while by the stove. Then finally he said, "I didn't realize how much everybody watches out for each other out here. They have to. Why? Because someday they might be the one needing help." He nodded thoughtfully. Outside, cold wind moved softly across the lake while darkness settled over the cabin country. And though Doug still had not gotten his caribou, I could already see something changing in him. Part 4. The next morning began with trouble. Not serious trouble yet, but the kind that makes experienced people pay attention. By the time Chris arrived to fly us out, the air temperature had already started warming faster than normal. You could feel it even standing near the lake. The cold sharpness from dawn had disappeared, replaced by softer, heavy air. Chris noticed it immediately. Bush pilots notice weather the same way trappers notice tracks. He stood beside the plane for a moment, looking over the lake and then at the gear. "I'm going to split the load," he said finally. Doug looked over. "What do you mean?" "I'll take you down to Blue Lake first and come back for Norman." Doug tried to hide his disappointment, but I could tell he did not like the idea of sitting alone out there. "You'll be all right," I told him. "Yeah. There's nothing at Blue Lake except mosquitoes and scenery." That got a little smile out of him. Chris loaded Doug and part of the gear first. Before climbing in, Doug paused and looked back toward the cabin one last time. For a moment, he just stood there quietly. I remember thinking how much different he looked from the boy who had arrived a few days earlier. Not older exactly, just steadier. The plane lifted off the lake and disappeared southward between the hills. While Chris was gone, I packed the last of the gear and cleaned the cabin the way I always try to leave it. With stack dry, stove cleaned, food packed safely away, bunks straightened. A bush cabin deserved respect. Someday it might save your life. When Chris returned, the morning had grown noticeably warmer. He climbed out shaking his head slightly. "Air's heating up fast." "That bad?" "We'll see." Now, warm air might not sound dangerous to people who are unfamiliar with small aircraft, but bush pilots paid close attention to temperature. Warmer air meant less lift, and less lift mattered a great deal when you were trying to get a loaded float plane airborne from Short Lake surrounded by wilderness. We loaded the remaining gear and climbed in. Chris taxied out carefully on a Blue Lake. I remember looking down the length of the water, thinking it suddenly seemed shorter than before. The engine roared. The floats hammered across the surface. Spray kicked up beside us. But something felt wrong almost immediately. The plane stayed heavy. Too heavy. We were moving fast, but not climbing. The shoreline ahead started coming closer much faster than I liked. Chris pulled back slightly. Nothing. The plane refused to lift. I remember watching the trees near the end of the lake and thinking very calmly, well, this isn't going well. Then Chris chopped power. The plane settled back onto the water hard and began slowing. Nobody spoke for a second. Finally, Chris exhaled and shook his head. Too warm. I nodded. Doug would later ask if I was scared during that takeoff attempt. Truthfully, yes. Not panicked. Not helpless. But very aware that we were close to running out of lake. That is something wilderness teaches people. Fear is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply clarity. Chris taxied us back slowly through the lilies near shore and turned the plane around again. You want to wait? I asked him. He looked at the sky for a long moment. No, I think we can get her out if I get a better run. That was the thing about experienced men. They stayed calm because panic solved nothing. We lined up again. The engine surged. This time Chris held the floats just a bit longer, pushing every bit of speed he could get from the water. The lake raced beneath us. The far shoreline came toward us again. Closer, closer, and then finally the floats broke free. The plane lifted into the air. Not gracefully either, more like a stubborn bird forcing itself upward. But once we were airborne, we climbed steadily. I remember finally taking a full breath again. Chris grinned, slightly without taking his eyes off the windshield. Thought we might be spending another night out there. Wouldn't have been the worst thing. No, he admitted. But I'd already promised Doug breakfast somewhere besides a cabin. When we landed at Blue Lake to pick him up, Doug tried hard to act unconcerned. You guys took a while. Chris laughed. We were just adding excitement to your vacation. Doug looked at me. Something happened. Plane didn't want to fly. His eyes widened immediately. That's bad, right? It's not ideal. After we loaded him back in, Chris flew low over parts of Old Man Lake before heading toward Taslina. On the way, we stopped at the outlet where the red salmon were spawning. Thousands of fish crowded the shallows, their bodies glowing crimson beneath the moving water. Doug stared down at them in amazement. I've never seen anything like that. Most people haven't. Swans drifted farther out on the lake, while ducks lifted from the reeds ahead of the plane. The whole country looked alive. Chris pointed toward several old cabins tucked among the trees. 3 different guys we know have cabins around here, he said. Doug leaned toward the window, trying to see everything at once. For a 15-year-old boy, Alaska could feel endless. And in some ways it was. Back in Elchina, life slipped quickly into its usual rhythm again. Laundry, repairs, fuel, hauling gear, helping around the lodge. One evening, I had supper over at Dan's place. We grilled halibut and sat around afterward talking while late summer sunlight stretched across the yard. Sam Weaver had returned from a job by then, and before long, I was driving him out toward his cabin near mile 149. That stretch of late August turned unusually warm. One day reached nearly 78 degrees, which was strange weather for that time of year. Nobody trusted it. In Alaska, warm weather late in the season often felt temporary, like the country was giving you one last break before winter started closing in. Toward the end of the month, Henry told me there was work available up near Delta Junction, helping build a grain storage facility. So I headed north. Even that trip turned into an Alaska story. Along the road, I found 2 old truck wheels somebody had thrown away at a pull-off. Rusty things, but useful. In Alaska, people learned not to overlook material just because it looked rough. One man's junk became another man's trailer repair. When I reached Delta Junction, they put me to work almost immediately. Tree felling first, then skidding logs, then carpenter work. I worked long days there. One afternoon, the wind got so strong while I was cutting timber that I could no longer control where the trees would fall safely. That is dangerous country for a sawyer. Trees twist strangely in high winds. Limbs snap unpredictably. Entire trunks can barber chair and split backward toward you. I finally shut the saw down and headed back toward the building site. No job is worth dying over. At night, I slept in little trailers near the work area and listened to rain drum against the roof while men swapped stories about equipment, weather, hunting, and money. Most Alaska conversations eventually returned to one of those subjects. Then September arrived. The light changed first. Days still felt long to people from the lower 48, but up there you noticed the darkness returning quickly now. Mornings came later. Evenings cooled faster. The tundra began turning rusty red and gold. I flew back out to the cabin again with Dennis for another hunting trip. Dennis had never been there before, so I spent part of the first day simply showing him the country. We hunted hard, long circles around the lakes. Bench country above Nye, draws thick with brush, and saw almost nothing. That surprises people sometimes. They imagine Alaska overflowing with game behind every tree. The truth is, there are days you can walk until your legs ache and see little more than birds and tracks. One evening, Dennis asked, "Does it bother you when you come all the way out here and don't get anything?" "No. Really? Nope. Why not?" I looked out across the lake for a moment before answering. Because getting something isn't the only reason to come. That is difficult for some people to understand. The country itself mattered. The quiet mattered. The challenge mattered. And sometimes the people beside you mattered most of all. A few days later, Daryl and I headed out again in the swamp buggy, looking overland in the Green Acres area where the state was opening remote parcels for claims. That trip felt wild in an entirely different way. We followed old seismic trails through country hardly touched by people. One morning we climbed a brushy rise in the Mean Machine, and right at the top we found where a grizzly had made a kill. Brush torn flat, earth dug up, part a young moose still lying there uneaten. Daryl looked over at me. He's probably close. Probably. But inside that swamp buggy, we felt reasonably secure. Later we reached Old Boot Lake. The place was beautiful. Wind moving across dark water. Small lakes scattered through the tundra. Tracks everywhere, wolf, moose, caribou. Daryl and I each picked out 40-acre parcels side by side that we hoped to claim someday. He chose land near another lake nearby that he later named Satiety. I chose Old Boot Lake itself. Funny thing is, when I think back on all those trips now, I remember the hunting and the machines and the lakes. But I remember Doug too. Because somewhere during those days, between missed shots and long hikes and cabin chores and dangerous flights, a 15-year-old boy had started learning what Alaska demanded from people. Patience, responsibility, attention, calmness, respect for weather, respect for animals, respect for other people. Those lessons mattered more than whether he shot a caribou. A lot of boys become men gradually without anybody noticing the moment it starts. But sometimes you do notice. Sometimes you see it happen in little pieces. The way a boy begins carrying himself differently. The way he listens more carefully. The way he stops trying to impress everybody. The way he begins understanding that confidence and recklessness are not the same thing. The trip with Doug reminded me how important mentorship really is, especially in a place like Alaska. Because the wilderness was always teaching lessons, whether people meant for it to or not. The question was whether somebody older took the time to help a young person understand those lessons before the country taught them the hard way. This concludes our episode. If you're enjoying the story and would like the books this story is based on, go to 10,000daysinalaska.com for more info. A new episode will air next Saturday at 7 a.m. Alaska time. And for all you Midwesterners watching and listening, that means 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time.